Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Macon Stewart, and we're going to give just another second for folks to continue to roll in. I see the number is climbing, which is exciting. So we're going to give it like another 30 seconds, and then we will get started. Just welcome, everyone. Excited to have all of you all on today. We hope that this webinar is educational, informative, and shifts you all to action. So welcome and thank you. While we are waiting to get started, if folks don't mind just typing in the chat who you are and where you're from, city, state, and organization, that would be helpful for us. Just want to get a sense of who all is in the room. Alex and Alex, are you all hearing me okay?
Yep.
Wonderful.
Yep. Yeah, it looks like folks are starting to chime in on the chat.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Macon Stewart. I'm a Senior Deputy Director with the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, which is a part of the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. And I am excited to be joined by my colleague, Alex Miller, who will also introduce herself to speak to you all today about, I would say, a topic that has become near and dear to both of us for a number of different reasons. You know, obviously, I am a Black woman. I am raising Black girls, but also in the work that we do, we have just seen, I would say it's been very clear that there are disparities across the board, quite frankly, but it has risen up in our work, just seeing just the variance in what Black girls experience when compared to even, you know, Black and brown boys and absolutely their white counterparts, which all of us know. So, you know, Alex and I, along with other colleagues who will likely reference throughout this, have just sought to really start to dig into this a little bit more to understand more so what's happening with Black girls and just do more education and awareness for folks to really understand or see that that there is something different that's happening. And so while the outcomes are abysmal for kids who are in custodial systems, there is something in particular that Black girls are experiencing that makes them distinct from all other young people who are involved in these systems. So my hope is that, you know, through today's presentation, we'll give some awareness to just what we're seeing, but also a call to action for folks to be doing something a little bit different and paying attention to what's happening with this group of young people. Alex, you can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So this is who we are. This is where we work. And I'm going to allow Alex to jump in and introduce herself, and then also just give you a little bit of background of a partnership that we had that was the impetus for some of our focus on Black girls as well. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Macon, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Alex Miller. I'm the Deputy Director for Multisystem Operations at the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. I've been at CJJR for about 5 years now. I've worked very closely with Macon during this time. And as Macon noted, the topic of Black girls has been something that's come up time and time again. And we just thought it was about time that we actually start shining some light on this very special population. And one of the ways that we kind of segued us into this focus was our partnership with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, otherwise known as NCMEC. We actually co-authored a report with NCMEC last fall that focused on kind of adding research to some of the data that they collect on young people who go missing from foster care across the country. So during our talk today, we're going to weave in some of that information, but we also pull in information from a number of other sources because, as you'll see, this isn't a population that is often focused on. And so there is a lot of needing to kind of connect the dots. And so our hope today is that we'll be able to do that for you, and then you'll be able to turn around and use it in your work and in your community. Macon, is there anything else you wanted to add there? Nope. Okay, awesome. Alex, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. All right, so before we jump in and talk about Black girls and youth, I want to paint a bigger picture for you. So 50% of all missing persons reported in 2022 were female. You can see on this slide, it was a little over 271,000 females. And so to kind of understand the gravity of who went missing, we need to take a look at the general female population first. And that's what you're seeing on this graph here on the left. So when you're looking at this graph, you'll see that white females compose almost 3/4 of the female population. Black females are under 1/5 of the population. Native or American Indian females are about 1%, and Asian females are 8%. And this is females of all ages. Now, what I'd like to do is have you look at that in comparison to another chart. So Alex, can you pull that other chart up? Thank you. So what you're seeing in this chart here is the demographic breakdown of females who went missing in 2022. So if we're looking across both of these, you'll notice that white females are less than 60% of those who go missing, despite constituting almost 3/4 of the general population. Black females, on the other hand, are 20% or under 20% of the general population of females, but are close to 40% of those who go missing. And Native women and girls, like Black females, are also twice as likely to go missing compared to the general population. Now, I don't know about you, but what I've seen in the news and the media and in true crime documentaries would really have me believe that someone who looks like me has a much higher likelihood of going missing than other demographic groups. But that's simply not true. And this is what's known as missing white woman syndrome. And it tends to skew our perception of who is missing and who is in danger. And so today, Macon and I really want to rectify that by spotlighting a population who are really too often disregarded, and that's Black girls. Next slide, please. Thanks, Alex. All right. So according to the NCIC Missing and Unidentified Persons database, close to 360,000 children under the age of 18 went missing in 2022. 29% of those children who went missing were white females, which is just slightly over their representation in the general child population at 25%. However, if we look at Black females, we see that Black female children were 21% of missing minors, and yet they only represent 7% of the general child population, meaning they are 3 times as likely to be reported missing. So if we kind of move your eyes down to the bottom of this slide, the data down here is from NCMEC, and this is specific to children who were missing from state care. So in 2022, there were 22,000 reports. Note, those are reports, not individual children, who went missing from state care. 94% of those reported missing were labeled as endangered runaways. And I really want to hold on to that term for a second here, because there's a lot of issues around this term. Alex, can you go to the next slide? And by the way, for those of you who are looking and thinking that I'm talking to myself and asking myself to advance the next slide, my colleague Alex Perry is actually on here running the slides. So I promise I'm not talking to myself. So let's talk a little bit about this term runaway, and I'll tell you why I have some issues with it. So first and foremost, Amber Alerts are not issued for runaway children because they're not perceived to have gone missing under dangerous or illicit circumstances. And that's just simply a bad assumption to make, and Macon and I are going to get into that. Another issue with this term is that it is far more likely to be used to describe children and youth of color than it is to describe white children. And if we're calling Black and brown children runaways instead of naming them as missing, we know that their names are less likely to get media coverage, kind of going back to what I talked about in the beginning. And the icing on the cake with this term is that it's used in such a way that results in girls and females being more likely to be arrested and detained for the crime of running away. This term really places the onus of a child going missing on the child herself. It ignores the context around why she's missing, why she's fleeing a dangerous or abusive foster placement, or if she is, and if she's being victimized in other ways like trafficking. And so when we talk about the perception of who's in danger and the fact that we label Black youth and girls as runaways more often than other groups, we really can't overlook this phenomenon known as adultification bias. If you're not familiar with this term, it's essentially the perception that children and youth of color are older and more culpable for their behaviors than their same age peers. Black girls in particular are viewed as having more knowledge of adult topics like sex. They're viewed as being more independent, and they're viewed as being less in need of nurturing. And so when we continue to label Black girls as runaways, it just further signals this idea that they don't need our help, they're fine, they're responsible for themselves, they're good. And this is in spite of science that shows that Black girls, like every other teenager, their brains aren't fully developed and they have the same qualities as other teenagers. They do need our support, they do need our nurturing. Alex, next slide, please. So one kind of big case that did get picked up by the media a few years ago was that of Cyntoia Brown. She's now Cyntoia Brown-Long. If you're unfamiliar with Cyntoia's story, Cyntoia was adopted as a young child. When she was 16 years old, she was on the run from a juvenile residential facility, and this led her to be held captive by her boyfriend. I'm putting that in quotes because he was most definitely not a boyfriend. Held captive in a hotel room where she was repeatedly beaten, raped, and sold for sex. She was then later criminalized for the murder of one of her abusers, and she was charged as a prostitute for killing that man who had purchased her for sex. Now, Cyntoia's story might seem like a really extreme example to use here, but if you remove that fact that she killed one of her abusers, her story is really, really similar to so many other youth of color in terms of being penalized for surviving trafficking and other forms of abuse. So as we continue to talk about Black girls, I want you to think about Cyntoia throughout this presentation. And Macon, I think it's heading your way.
It is. Thank you, Alex. And I did just post in the chat asking folks if you have questions to feel free to type them in the chat and we will respond throughout the duration of this presentation. So I'm going to spend, and let me check with Alex Perry. Were there other announcements you had for folks?
No, I just answered that we will be sharing the recording of this and related resources to everyone.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I'm going to spend a few moments just talking about the link between missing children and their involvement with multiple systems, because really that's where a high degree of vulnerability occurs for this population. Next slide, Alex. So you'll see here the information on the slide just relative to what the research says about young people who encounter these systems. One of the things that I want to focus on is just the fact of what this does for young people. We often think about the over surveillance or over policing and the implications that it has on incarceration, and it absolutely does. However, over surveillance can come in a number of different forms. So if we think about young people within school buildings, so we think about teachers and educators and other mandated reporters, a lot of times what they report or how they perceive a young person's behavior or a situation that a young person is going through can affect that young person, that family, in a multitude of ways. Namely, it can oftentimes result in young people being referred to the child welfare system as opposed to families being linked to services and supports that can better assist them. And therefore, what happens? That's a level of being over surveillance. That's a level of being over police. What we oftentimes see is how behaviors or how actions that a young person has, or even things like Alex spoke about adultification, how behaviors are perceived for Black girls in different settings is seen very differently than white girls. So what we oftentimes see is that, if we think about like dress code infractions, for example, and school is about to start, a young lady who is more curvy or more voluptuous in different ways, how her body is seen versus someone else who has a different figure may result in her being sent home, her getting infractions for dress code or not being told she's not dressed properly, being sent to ISS, or even just some of the behaviors that she may exhibit. There's just a variance in how those things are seen in Black girls in comparison to white girls, which can lead to things like suspension, expulsion, and things like that. Also, the reality is that abuse and neglect nor crime happens at a higher level of frequency in impoverished communities or communities of color. However, the engagement of law enforcement or other custodial systems Namely, child welfare does occur to a higher degree of frequency in these areas when compared to their white counterparts dwelling in more financially astute or affluent areas. And so, again, what we know is that folks who live in community, if we think about like Title I schools or communities where, there's just not that level of affluence. Those folks are going to have more encounters or likely to have more encounters with law enforcement or with social services or with juvenile services. I also think about when we think about kind of these interactions, the fact that now with the economy being what it is, and there are so many more families that are experiencing homelessness or that are couch surfing or that are transient, how are those families going to be perceived by folks who are mandated reporters, or if they come across folks in law enforcement? And those types of things too may play into what happens with this population of young people. Next slide, Alex. So I want to spend just a little bit of time just kind of making the link between multi-system involvement and young people who go missing, because the reality is there are so many risk factors that these young people face. But in order to understand how child welfare involved youth and children encounter juvenile justice, we have to start with the beginning, because Alex and I do a lot of work on what we call the phenomenon we call crossover, that impacts dual system youth, where in which young people fluctuate from one system to the other. And what the research tells us is generally young people who are in child welfare are more at risk for crossing over into the juvenile justice system. That's the most dominant pathway. But case in point, what we see is that there's disproportionality in both child welfare and in juvenile justice. When we think about young people who are involved in both, those rates exponentially spike. And what we know is that Black youth are disproportionately represented in child welfare and JJ systems respectively. The disparity grows only more egregious when we think about these dual system youth. And here's the kicker that connects to what we're talking about, is that Black youth appear up to 84% more than their rate in the child welfare only populations, and up to 43% more in comparison to the juvenile justice only population. Girls present a very similar example. Although they account for less than 30% of youth arrests, females compose between 1/3 and 1/2 of the dual system population. When the intersection of race and gender is considered, the disparity widens greatly. And so what this tells us is that as young people start to enter these systems, the likelihood of them going missing, specifically Black girls, it greatly increases. Next slide, please, Alex. So the why. Why does this tend to happen for young people who are in child welfare? Well, one of the things that young people who have extended stays in child welfare, those of us who have worked in or are working in child welfare systems know, is that young people of color tend to have a higher, they tend to have a lack of stability in the child welfare system. Older teens and young people of color tend to have more placement changes per year. Black girls are 23% of youth in foster care, but account for 36% of those who experience 10 plus placement changes. And so if we just think about everything that goes into where you live, I mean, the rest of your life functions based on where you are. There are things like your school, your peer interactions, your social environment, all that is connected to where you live at. And so if I'm a young person who has been removed from my family and is in a placement, and I'm constantly moving placements, that means that I'm lacking people. I don't have people who I'm connected to, people who I know, people who can be accountable to me and I can be accountable to, and I don't have those relationships. So it creates a higher level of vulnerability for me to go missing. And as you can see here, 35% of children missing from foster or group homes were Black. Next slide, please. So to transition us a little bit into talking about some of the other factors that are impacted based on all of these placement moves, which again, all of these create vulnerabilities in young people, in that for every time a young person moves, there's likely to be a change in school placement. And for that, there's a regression in their learning, which is about 6 months. So if we think about the last slide, talked about 3+, I think it was 3+ placements and some who had 10+ placements. If all of those results in a change in school, these young people are not learning anything, quite frankly. And what is more likely to happen is that these young people will end up dropping out, which of course has just a ripple effect in their progress and their ability to be self-sufficient adults. And so again, it just creates just another, just a endless spiral of negative outcomes and experiences that these young people face. And again, how this impacts Black girls is just very different from how it impacts other young people who are clients and receiving services from these systems. Next slide, please. Um, so this next slide just speaks to some of what I've already referenced in terms of what young people, how young people are impacted by the lack of placement stability and what placement mobility does for these young people. Social connections and experiences are lacking. They don't have those connections with folks in their community. There aren't those cultural connections for them. What we also know is that majority of foster placements are with white families. And so when young people are placed in those, they don't have those community connections. And obviously, folks from other cultures can be very intentional about what it is they expose the young people to, how they keep them connected, but there's still just going to be absence of many things. The other fact of the matter is that these young people have experienced so much trauma. What we know is that young people who enter the child welfare system generally have experienced at least one traumatic event, and we never know how that trauma is going to play itself out when these young people are in placement. And also if we think about how the traumatic experience that they face prior to coming into system, how that is therefore compounded upon while they are in the system. The fact that I have been removed from my family is a traumatic event. The fact that I'm going to live with a stranger who knows where is a traumatic event. You know, the fact that I am changing schools, I'm living in a home environment that may seem better, but these are strangers. These are not people that I know. So all of those are traumatic events that young people experience. And also just like I would say the lack of access to quality services. For those of us who have worked in any type of system of care, we all know that a lot of the services, while they may be the best of what we have to offer, they're not always good. And so, but these are the choices that we have to make for the young people that we serve. And a lot of times the service options that we're providing aren't necessarily going to meet the need that they have. But, you know, these are the experiences that these young people face. And a couple of other things to note that impact, I would say, the vulnerability that these young people experience too, is the fact that Black girls tend to spend more time in foster care when compared to their counterparts. They're less likely to experience reunification or adoption and are less likely to have access to services, as was just referenced. All right, next slide. I'm gonna toss it over to Alex.
Thanks, Macon. So as Macon just mentioned, Black girls and Black children tend to be in foster care for longer periods of time. They face higher rates of placement mobility. And this, unfortunately, isn't the only issue facing these kiddos in foster care. So as these young people age, they're less likely to be welcomed into family placements. And so they're more likely to be placed in congregate or group home care. And so there's a lot of implications of this. So for starters, youth in group homes are more likely to abscond from placement. And in fact, 65% of children missing from care, as identified in that NCMEC report we talked about earlier, they were missing from these types of placements specifically. And the use of congregate care particularly impacts youth of color, since Black children and Black youth are the least likely of any demographic to achieve permanency or reunify with their families. And so they're placed at higher rates in these more risky placements. And again, there's a lot of implications of that, one of them being commercial sexual exploitation. So Alex, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So commercial sexual exploitation, or CSE, there are so many misconceptions around this. A lot of folks think, oh, well, it only affects, a small number of kids, or kids are literally kidnapped off the street in vans like you might see in an action movie. And while maybe those things occur now and again, the reality is that most traffickers form relationships with children and youth by posing as a boyfriend or a loved one or a confidant. They buy them things, they make promises about a future. Essentially, they fill a physical or emotional need of the child to establish a trust or a bond. And this really isn't that hard to do, considering that one of the most common experiences of youth who are CSE survivors is that they've experienced past child abuse. So these are kids who are particularly vulnerable and easy to manipulate. And yes, I see that family-based trafficking is also in there. Absolutely. So I didn't go into that only because we're talking about specifically kids in foster care, but that is most definitely a huge, huge factor there for sure. Um, and it's also really hard to pin down the specific number of child sex trafficking victims because the issue itself, it's underreported, it's underdetected. But there are estimates that hold that hundreds of thousands of children and youth are victims of sex trafficking each year. Hundreds of thousands. And 60% of trafficking victims uncovered by the FBI were children in foster care. So again, not to say that other children are not survivors or have not been victimized in this way, but kiddos in foster care are particularly vulnerable. And again, Black and brown youth are overrepresented in the foster care system. Now, one thing I do want to make clear here is that it's not just foster care in and of itself that's this big risk factor. It's really the use of group care. So case in point, if you're looking at the stats on this slide, there was a study in Los Angeles that found that foster youth who were trafficked were 4 times more likely to have lived in group homes than those who were not CSE victims. And similarly, a study in Florida found that 4 out of 5 foster youth who were trafficked had been in group homes. So really seeing that as a very big trend among trafficking victims, excuse me. Next slide, please. All right, so let's tie this back into Black girls, because I'm sure you've kind of noticed so far that a lot of the information that we are kind of tossing your way requires us to connect these dots. It's pretty rare that we're actually seeing data being collected on the intersection of race and sex. But the risk of sex trafficking, it's not equally distributed among groups. Black children and especially Black girls are they're substantially more likely to be victims of commercial sexual exploitation in comparison to their white peers. And this is across the country, even in places where youth of color represent a really small proportion of that population. We're still seeing these numbers skyrocket. So the data that you're seeing on this slide, there are 3 different studies from different parts of the country. So that first pie graph there, 49% of child sex trafficking survivors in Louisiana were Black girls. The next pie chart, 52% of children who were trafficked in King County, Washington were Black. That study didn't look at the intersection of sex. And then that last chart there, 66% of child sex trafficking victims in Alameda, California were Black girls. Again, we're talking about 3 different parts of the country here, and the trend is still pervasive. And so, think back to who is more likely to be placed in foster care? Black children. Who's more likely to move around in foster care? Black children. And who's more likely to end up in group homes? Black children. All of these things are connected, plain and simple. There is not a coincidence here. Next slide, please. So besides the horror of being trafficked, there are a lot of other consequences of trafficking, including things like unwanted pregnancies, contracting an STI, developing a substance use disorder, and developing psychological conditions like depression, anxiety, suicidality, and PTSD. And many of these things can result in youth experiencing things like emotional dysregulation, disassociation, negative self-image, and just difficulty with relationships with their peers and with adults. And in addition to these psychological and physical damages, youth who are trafficking victims are often criminalized for their victimization. And this is just one of the ways that Black girls in particular who are in foster care come into contact with the juvenile legal system. So as a country, we're moving away from labeling children as prostitutes, but I will say this change has been largely at a glacial pace. As recently as 2019, the FBI was still identifying minors charged with prostitution, over half of which were Black youth. I'm sure I don't need to say this to you if you're on this webinar, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's no such thing as a child prostitute. If you can't legally consent to sex, you cannot be a sex worker. Plain and simple. So besides that, what else do we mean when we're saying that trafficking victims are being criminalized for their exploitation? So we might be less likely to charge a young person with prostitution, but we're still arresting and charging youth for behaviors and activities that are tangential to their trafficking. So survival crimes, so things like theft and assault, low-level offenses like trespassing, and status offenses like truancy and running away, those are all symptoms or can be symptoms of exploitation. And these are also some of the most common charges among Black girls in particular. So something to keep in mind there. Again, sometimes you've got to connect those dots yourself. Next slide, please. All right, so sticking with the legal system topic here, other ways that foster youth come into contact with law enforcement is through their placements. Foster youth in group homes are significantly more likely to be referred to police than their foster peers in other settings. So if you're looking at this chart here, this is a study from a county in Washington State where 31% of youth who were not in group homes, but who were in foster care placements were arrested. And while that's a really, really high rate, what's worse is that 56% of youth in group homes had been referred to police. Now, don't get me wrong, both statistics are unacceptable. They're extremely high, but there's a 25% difference for those kiddos in congregate care. And we also know that youth in congregate care are more likely to recidivate or reoffend than youth in more family-like placements. And additionally, placement disruptions, they affect boys and girls differently. Boys aren't statistically more likely to face arrest until they've moved 3 times at least, but any placement change increases the likelihood for arrest among girls. And think back to that slide that Macon had up earlier. Black girls see so many placement changes. And in comparison to girls in the general population, those in foster care are 4 times more likely to be incarcerated. 4 times. Astronomical. Next slide, please. So shifting our focus back to how foster youth end up involved in the justice system or the legal system, foster care placements aren't the only location where youth are at risk for negative interactions with law enforcement and negative interactions with other professionals as well. And Macon alluded to this earlier, but school is a place where youth should feel safe. That should be their one place they can go to on a daily basis and feel comfort and have some sort of consistency. But oftentimes for foster youth, and especially for Black girls, it is the exact opposite of that. And as a former teacher, I taught for a number of years outside of DC. This really makes my heart hurt, but it's the truth of the matter. If you're looking at the statistics here, you see that compared to white girls, Black girls are 5 times more likely to experience out-of-school suspension. They're 3 times more likely to be expelled, and they're 3 times as likely to be arrested from school. So what the heck is going on here? Why are Black girls at such a risk for exclusionary school discipline? Well, first and foremost, we can't ignore factors like racism and adultification and cultural biases. Most teachers look like me. But another huge factor here is that misdiagnosed and undiagnosed trauma play a big role in how these children engage in the world around them. So trauma responses can really easily be misinterpreted as defiance or as apathy. Trauma responses might look like anger outbursts or mistrust of authority or just kind of spacing out and ignoring the person who's talking to you, things like that. And all of these things can be interpreted subjectively as code of conduct violations if they're not recognized as reflections of trauma. And you know who's faced a lot of trauma? Girls in foster care. I don't know if you know this, you might, but kids in foster care actually experience higher rates of PTSD than war veterans. And studies have shown that up to 92% of girls in foster care experience PTSD. And so what happens when we punish students for their trauma responses? Well, they're probably less likely to go to school. And many foster youth also have trouble keeping up in school due to the number of placement changes and school changes they experience, which can also lead them to stop attending school. Also, being a victim of commercial sexual exploitation, one of the symptoms of that, so to speak, is stopping attending school. And so we often refer to this as truancy, right? Well, not so fun fact here, girls are more likely than boys to be referred to the juvenile legal system for truancy. And so we're oftentimes punishing these children for being victims. It's very cyclical. Next slide, please. All right, so let's take a quick peek at girls in the legal system. First and foremost, and I really can't say this enough, the majority of girls, and in fact, the majority of just youth generally in juvenile detention are victims. 4 out of 5 girls in detention are victims of sexual violence. And in fact, girls who are victims of commercial sexual exploitation tend to have deeper involvement in the juvenile legal system than their peers who have not been trafficked. So think back to, what we talked about regarding behaviors and events that are often tangential to being sex trafficked. Usually low-level offenses and status offenses accompany this type of victimization. So again, I'm going to kind of bring this full circle here. Black children are overrepresented in the foster care system. They're more likely to be placed in congregate care and to experience high rates of placement instability. Placement in congregate care also increases the likelihood that youth will go missing, and it elevates the chances of them being trafficked. And all of these things can lead them to arrest. Furthermore, congregate care increases the likelihood that a youth will face arrest in placement. So we're not even talking about if they abscond, they get involved with a trafficker. Just being in placement alone increases that likelihood of police contact. And if that doesn't get them through the door of the legal system, school is yet another place where Black girls in foster care can find themselves involved with police. Black girls account for over 1/3 of girls in detention, and they're more likely to be there because of, bells are going to go off, running away. So instead of issuing Amber Alerts for these children, we're issuing jumpsuits. There's a big issue with that. And I also just want to pause for a second and highlight that system-involved LGBTQ youth also need to be talked about, because race and sex and gender identities, they don't just exist as checkboxes on a database. They exist in tandem, and system workers and just us as a society, we respond to youth differently based on the intersection of those identities, and that's consciously or otherwise. And LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in the child welfare system. They're also seen at higher rates in the juvenile legal system. And in fact, 40% of females in the juvenile legal system identify as lesbian, bisexual, questioning, and gender nonconforming. And even more, the majority of those kiddos are Black. So while data collection methods might be falling short right now of documenting the nuances and the intersections of those identities, I would really be remiss if I didn't mention that Black girls, those that we're speaking of today, they're so much more than just Black girls. And I really mean that in every sense of that phrase. So again, please think about when we're processing this information, it's not just Black girls. There's so much more than just Black girls. All right, I'll jump off my soapbox there. Alex, can you go to the next slide? All right, so before I pass things off to Macon, I just want to take a quick look at some of the outcomes that are facing youth who are in child welfare and the juvenile justice systems, because they don't stay kids forever. They grow up, they become adults, and there's implications for their experiences as adults based on what they experience as children. So homelessness is a huge one. 1 in 5 kids who age out of foster care report experiencing homelessness. Many also battle substance use and various other mental and behavioral health disorders throughout their lifetime. 1 in 5 youth who age out of foster care will face incarceration within the first few years of their aging out. And it's also, I think it's about 1/5 of women who are incarcerated say that they've been in foster care. They were in foster care when they were younger. And one other big point here, involvement in the child welfare system, very cyclical. Over 30% of youth who age out of foster care end up becoming parents by the age of 21. And younger parents are more likely to end up involved in the child welfare system and to have children who become involved with the legal system. And this harps back to a number of factors that Macon was talking about before too. It's that over surveillance. It's the mandated reporting, and why aren't we offering services as opposed to penalizing families that are in need? Financial instability is another huge factor that lasts or can last a lifetime. Less than 60% of youth who age out of foster care report any level of employment by the time they turn 21. And all of this perpetuates the cycle of trauma for these young people who become adults and for their families and their communities. All right, I've probably bummed you out enough, so I'm going to pass it on to Macon. Macon's hopefully gonna change the mood a little bit with what we can do about this.
Thank you, Alex. One of the things I want to say before I jump into talking about some of the things that all of us can do, regardless of where we sit within our respective positions in systems. Number one is to understand that by not doing something, we are being complicit in exacerbating this issue. A lot of times when we go into jurisdictions to work with them, they will say, well, we are doing a number of reforms. And because we're doing the reforms and this population of young people will be the recipient of said services or said change, then we should see an impact on them. And while they are correct, if we're not paying particular attention to this specific population of young people, then the impact may be minimal. So, for example, in communities where they say we're focused on detention, we're doing detention reform. And so, because we're doing this large detention reform, Black girls will be impacted that because it's going to impact all kids. Yes and no. They will be, they should be, but if we're not focusing and drilling down on what that experience is of the Black girl, of the brown girl, then we're not taking into consideration those additional things that need to be done to target them having improved outcomes. Will there be some change because we're doing something different at large? Yes, but we won't have maximum impact because we're not singularly focused on what their issues are, what their needs are, and how we can improve. So I also just want to put that out there for folks because we hear that all the time. People will say, oh, we're engaged in doing this model or doing this reform or doing this effort. And because we're impacting all kids, we don't need to segment out a subpopulation. You do. You absolutely need to. So with that, Alex, next slide. So a couple of things to keep in mind relative to how we can make change and impact Black girls. Number one is to keep families together. That is just the hard and fast of it. It's interesting. We remove young people from what we determine to be an abusive or neglectful situation, but we generally, as systems, don't have a place for them to go. We can't guarantee their safety when we remove them. Not just to say that no child should be removed, because there absolutely are some kids that need to be, but we also need to be ensuring that where we're putting them at and where they're going to, that where they're going to transition is a safe space. We also need to be ensuring that we're identifying resources within the community that can help meet their needs. And that, again, these are places that are really culturally sufficient to help work with these young people. The other thing is just thinking about what that young person's needs are, basic needs, food, clothing, housing, shelter. I think about the fact that the image is important, and how I feel about myself translates to how I interact with when I go out into the world. And so when we think about that relative to Black girls, if we're having to move them and put them in placement, how are we attending to ensuring that they have hygiene items, ensuring that they have what they need to make sure that their hair is taken care of so that they can feel good and they can begin to navigate these new spaces with a level of confidence that we want them to have. Also, just thinking about the resources that exist within the communities that these young people come from. Our first go-to should not be that I'm going to take them out, but what can I put in to better support their family so that this young person can stay within the context of their family and their community. Also, just thinking about not just the child, but thinking about the child in the context of the family. How can I support mom, dad, grandma, or whomever else can be a support to this young person? And also considering the fact that I know in child welfare, people oftentimes only think about who can this child be placed with. They don't think about how other community members, families can be resources. It may be that this young person does have to be removed, but they can also remain connected to their aunts, remain connected to their uncle, to still have a context and a connection to their family to some degree. So also just thinking about some of the formal and informal supports that these young people and family receive, ensuring that there's not a, we're very good on the front end of doing assessments, but we're not good at feeling feeling the need that the assessment has identified. So ensuring that those formal supports that these families and young people need, that they're actually getting, and making sure that they're culturally sufficient for the Black girls. Next slide, please. Um, Maintaining community and cultural connections. I just spoke to this a little bit, but making sure that we're prioritizing relative and kinship placements, and making sure that we are resourcing monetarily and otherwise those relatives and family members who will serve as a placement resource for these young people, or who will serve as any kind of resource for them. We're very good at making sure that foster parents have and foster parents should have, but we can also provide that same degree of resource and support to families. Also thinking about how we recruit families to serve as placement providers for these young people, going to these communities and identifying foster parents, whether that's through faith-based initiatives, connecting with fraternities and sororities and things like that, but thinking about civic groups and other things within communities that are that can serve as supports for these young people. Also, another thing here that is very important is just maintaining family connections and keeping siblings together. And as a former social worker, I know that while that is oftentimes the goal, that oftentimes is not the reality, but there can be a connection. Even if we can't place siblings together, we can absolutely make sure that siblings are visiting and that they have regular contact with each other, so that they are still able to maintain those bonds. Next slide, please. Next is just about mobility. Alex spoke a lot about what happens when young people are in group homes and in those different types of congregate care settings. There's just increased risk level, there's more vulnerability. And so what we really want to do is diminish our reliance on group homes or any type of congregate care facility, because young people are then supervised by staff. They are treated very differently from young people who are placed within a home environment. And, Alex already spoke to kind of the end result of that. We also want to improve existing conditions for young people who are having to go into congregate placement. So ensure that there's gender responsive programs. Ensure that young people are not having the police called on them when they exhibit a behavior that may be the reason why they are in this type of setting that has a higher level of care. We've seen that a lot in our work where, let's say a young person is placed in a residential facility because they have a certain diagnosis. And then when they start exhibiting the behavior that is connected to their diagnosis, there is not de-escalation techniques used. There is not treatment provided. The police become the treatment, and the young person therefore crosses over to the delinquency system. So when we are placing young people, we need to ensure that wherever they are being placed is equipped to serve the needs that they have. And also, whenever placement moves are required, we want to try to make sure that we can keep some stability around the young person's school building, as well as their service providers whenever possible. Next slide, please. The other thing, and Alex spoke to this, is really recognizing trauma and victimization in young people and reframing our interpretation of their behaviors. Nowadays, being trauma informed and trauma responsive and all of that are buzzwords that are flying everywhere. But I don't know that us having a higher degree of understanding relative to trauma has resulted in people being more understanding and more patient, and more therapeutic in how they approach young people or how they deal with young people when these behaviors are exemplified as a result of the trauma they have experienced. So I think it's really important for us to take heed and understand when a young person is doing something that is absolutely a reflection of the experience, the traumatic experience that they've had. It's also incumbent upon not just us as service providers, but for us to make sure that we're imparting that type of information into the families and the families that are serving as foster families for these young people, as well as the folks who are on staff at our congregate care and group home facilities. They really need to understand what is what is a trauma response in a young person? And a lot of that just comes with people taking the time to get to know these young people. If I spend time getting to know you and developing a relationship with you, then I know what your triggers are. I know how you respond in certain situations. I know how to really help you de-escalate, and I know how to work with you to process your emotions and what it is that you're feeling, or when you retreat inward. I know how to work with you. But if we're not taking the time to, if we're just doing the assessments and checking off boxes and doing visits to check off boxes, and we're not developing relationships with young people, then we get what we get. And that's the unfortunate part of it. So really just, finding the space and taking the time to be there for that young person, or connecting them to a person who can be there. We used to have this program that we would refer families to called Go To. And this was a person who would become a go-to person for young people. I would even say like a mentor, because it's a heightened level of connection that they provide. But it's really important that we understand those things relative to young people, and that connections matter. And how we recognize trauma, how we deal with the fact that these young people have been victims is important. And we also have to recognize the fact that many of these young people are victimized while they are in custodial systems. And that is the reality. We just are not, I put in my notes, now we know where I put it at, that systems are not parents. They are not. They're not. A young person being in child welfare, being in the juvenile justice system, we aren't parents, and it's a system. And really, even saying the system removes a level of responsibility that the adults have to that young person who is on their caseload or who is on their docket. But young people need people. That's just the bottom line. And when I'm tied to a system and I'm moving from placement to placement, as we've talked about, these young people don't have people. And that's why they continue to be victimized and continue to be traumatized while they're in our care. So we have to step up and do something about that. Next slide, please. And here we go. Embrace harm reduction. Ensure that young people are made to feel safe wherever they're at. Alex talked a lot about the fact that schools should be a safe place for young people, and for many of them, Black girls, it is not. We need to figure out what we need to do within those environments and within communities to create that safe space for young people. Everybody needs a person, and everybody needs somewhere to go where they can just kind of be who they are, or unload or unpack, and all of that. So want to make sure that we are figuring out how we create a safe space within community for these young people, so that they have that place to go to. Next slide. Next is time. I just spoke about this a little bit when I talked about trauma. Make sure that we're checking in, make sure that we're building relationships, making sure that everybody has a trusted adult. Again, we've talked a lot about placement moves, school instability, all of that instability results in young people not being connected to people, and human relationships matter. And that's what makes the difference. If we look at anybody's success story, that has gone through anything, they always speak about having a person. Everybody needs somebody. Even as adults, we all need our person. We do. These young people are no different. And I would venture to say they need a person more so than anybody, because all of their people have been taken away from them, or they have been victims. And so they've not had the ability to develop that relationship with that person, with a person to be their person. But also remember, and Alex spoke about this, these are children. These are children. There's something that we used to refer to called the victim predator dichotomy, where young kids, when they came into the child welfare system, they were seen as victims. Once they got to be teenagers and the child welfare system had not achieved permanency and stability for them, and they moved around a lot, like we've talked about today, they were starting to see as different, and they were seen as predators. And so those young people were not seen as, oh, they've been victimized and we've not appropriately serviced them. They were seen as, oh, well, they won't stay in their placement, or they keep running away, or they're not going to school, or they're talking back. That victim part fell off as they got older. And so just keep in mind, yes, this may be a 16-year-old young woman who is curvy and has a lace front and eyelashes and all of the things that she is, but she is still yet a child. And we need to, treat her with a level of obviously respect and dignity, but understand that she's a child and a child who has experienced some things and has gone through a lot, and also may not have just had that development that children absence of system involvement has had. So next slide, please. So with that, Alex, I guess we're gonna take these together.
Yeah.
So I was gonna say, Alex, before you jump in, and I know we only have 4 minutes, there are just a few folks that I did want to make sure that we recognize and acknowledge. One of them is from the Black and Missing Foundation, which you see we have that link at the top. Beth Celestini, and I hope I said Beth's last name right, who is a part of the Black and Missing Foundation, doing amazing work around supporting missing Black girls. We also wanted to highlight and recognize Kalina Burks, who is the first director of the Office of Missing and Murdered Black Girls in the state of Minnesota, which is within their Department of Public Safety. Kalina is doing amazing work within Minnesota, and so we're excited to see where her work takes off. Also want to acknowledge our colleague at the center, Dr. Karen Koloboski, who also, this is a topic that resonates with her and is of interest to Karen, who I think she's in our audience, as well as Dr. Sherry Sims-Horton, who is from the University of New Hampshire, and also just very invested in understanding and researching this population of young people, and really supporting bringing education and awareness to what Black girls are experiencing.
Yeah. So Macon, you covered everything with that. I think the only thing I would add is that Director Kalina Burks is the first of her kind in the country. So amazing that Minnesota is at the forefront of that, and really looking forward to seeing the awesome work that she does. Excuse me, and hopeful that other states will mimic that position within their own states. So as Alex Perry noted in the chat, these resources will be sent out with the recording. And I just want to say thank you all so much for being a captive audience. We tried to answer all the questions in the chat, but if we missed any, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Yeah, we hope to connect with you again very soon.